there's always this assumption to say that before the missionaries came, we were just communicating with God via the ancestors. I think it's very important that we understand that, number one, not all the African tribes actually venerate the dead or communicate with the dead. Number two, Africa is not a monolithic entity. That means that not every African culture has the same customs and practices the same things, and I'll prove that to you just now. Number three, ancestral worship is actually a universal practice. If you go to China today, you'll find that the Chinese people venerate ancestors as much as the Africans do. I've been in funerals where there are black people and white people, and the white people at the end of the funeral go to the grave and speak to their ancestors, and I'm standing there as an African and I go, I don't practice this, right? So this is not a cultural thing. And this is how we must always understand that there's no ethnically based spiritual path, as Afrika Mhlope always says, that there's a spiritual path that's there for all people. If something is true, it's true for all people. If something is false, it's false for all people. If God hates something, he hates it when it's practiced by anybody, right? So ancestral worship is universal, and God universally hates it. He doesn't just hate it because Africans are practicing it. He hates it because it is something that undermines him. It's a principle. It's got nothing to do with hating black people and black culture and so on. And the fourth point is that culture is not static. Culture is always moving. Culture is ever changing. Culture is being developed as we speak. Culture is being changed and transformed as we speak. I mean, just coming back to the point of saying that not all African tribes venerate ancestors. Number one, the Maasai of Kenya, very famous. Most preserved African tradition. In fact, there's a few that we're learning of now in East Africa of the untouched people that are still living in the caves and so on. Most of these tribes don't practice communicating to the dead. Even the Khoi and the San, while they have a respect for those who have gone before them, but they don't necessarily venerate ancestors and focus on this communicating via the ancestors to God, but they're more focused on nature and so on. So coming back to my second point also is that you need to understand that African culture is not monolithic. And when I say African culture is not monolithic, if you look at the Zulus and the Xhosas, the Zulus and Xhosas originate from the Nguni sort of family tree. But the Xhosa, if you listen to their language, though it's similar to the Zulus, but it has cliques. And the cliques because they have some influence from the Khoi and the San. They've adopted all these things. The Xhosas practice circumcision. The Zulus actually don't practice circumcision. But it's very interesting that they used to practice circumcision until Shaka Zulu decided, actually, this practice is not helpful to us as Zulus because we're fighting all these wars. We're always at war. What's the point of sending people to do circumcision and initiation school for 3 months while we're busy fighting wars? And so Shaka Zulu actually said that thing must be stopped. But it's also very interesting that even though Shaka Zulu stopped it, but because people observed in KZN that medically it was very helpful for the boys to be circumcised, now they're doing it, even though they're doing it through the Department of Health, but they are doing it. But you can see that culture is not static. It's always changing. It's always moving. And culture is something that was made to serve us and not for us to serve culture and be slaves to culture. And not, and even when culture is not helpful to us, we just don't want to change it. We don't see the need to do anything differently. So this is very important for us to know that culture is always changing. And so we can change culture. If it doesn't serve us, we must be willing, like Shaka Zulu, to say, enough with this thing, we're going to put it aside. The third point is that, we've already highlighted as well with the Xhosas and the Zulus that also even the cosmology of the Zulus and the Xhosas is completely different. I've always said this in this channel. The Zulus claim to come from the reeds, and Venerate, who is God in the Zulus. So Zulus don't even have a God concept, which Xhosas have. Their God is called Kamata, the sky god, who's the creator god. The Zulus, call their god Venerate, who's actually the first ancestor, the first one to appear. But also in their cosmology, they claim that the first person or the first people came from the reeds. That's what the Zulus claim. But the Xhosas say the first people came from the caves, right? So these are people who are both African, but you can see their understanding of God is different. So it's okay for us to have a view of God that contradicts our own and not claim that we must have this one African concept of God, which doesn't exist, because even amongst the Zulus and the Xhosas, there's a completely different God concept. Now, after we've dealt with the cultural factor, now